I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, after a fresh round of talks between the Ukrainian and American delegations in Miami, we examine a new investigation that exposes the Trump administration's profit motives behind the emerging proposals. We then assess the resignation of Andriy Yermak, formerly Zelensky's right-hand man, and the unexpected intervention of former Commander-in-Chief Valerii Zaluzhnyi, viewed as preparing for a presidential run after the war. Afterwards, we analyse Kyiv's decision to strike the Russian shadow fleet off the coast of Senegal, and how Europe, and France in particular, is positioning itself for this next volatile phase.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 1st of December. 3 years and 282 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor for Defence, Dom Nicholls, our Executive Editor for Audio, Francis Dearnley, and our Brussels correspondent, Joe Barnes. But first, over to Francis for the major diplomatic updates.
On this day in 1991, Ukrainians overwhelmingly voted in favour of independence. 92% backed it in a referendum, with majorities in every single region of the country, including 83% of the residents of Donbass. Those territories Putin is seeking to seize in the east in an attempt to reunify them with Russia. We left you on Friday with the resumption of the latest round of peace negotiations focused on those exact same territories, and the breaking news that the head of President Zelensky's office and his chief negotiator, Andriy Yermak, had resigned after his offices were raided by Ukraine's anti-corruption bodies. I'll come to that story in a moment, but first the outcome of this weekend's meeting between the Kyiv delegation and the Americans at Steve Witkoff's private golf club north of Miami. Rustem Umerov, now taking over from Yermak, met with US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and Special Envoy Witkoff, whose appearance, rather bleary-eyed and unshaven, brought back memories for me of how Dom looked the morning after our live event in Washington a couple of years ago. Now, Umerov, you'll recall, was quizzed in relation to the corruption scandal last week, so his position isn't necessarily secure either. In a post on social media, he said Kyiv had achieved, quote, substantial progress in advancing a dignified peace and in converging our positions with the American side, following a difficult but productive round of negotiations. Axios reports that after an hour in a broader format, the meeting narrowed to 3 officials from each side, with the line of territorial control virtually the only issue discussed. Rubio called the meeting very productive as well, adding, the end goal is obviously not just the end of the war, that's essential and fundamental, but it's also about securing an end that leaves Ukraine sovereign and independent and with an opportunity of real prosperity. That wording will come as a relief to the Europeans, but is that the universal position of the Trump administration? On that question, as Witkoff and Kushner fly to Moscow today, I'd point you to the long read in the Wall Street Journal, one of the most important ones published recently, setting out the timeline of how the Trump administration's approach to peace talks is rooted fundamentally in profit. It starts with that now infamous meeting we know about between Witkoff, Kushner and Dmitriev, ostensibly to draw up a plan to end the war, but, in the words of the Journal, went much further, privately charting a path to bring Russia's $2 trillion economy in from the cold, with American businesses first in line to beat European competitors to the dividends. It goes on, quote, Dmitriev was pushing a plan for US companies to tap the roughly $300 billion of Russian central bank assets frozen in Europe for US-Russian investment projects and a US-led reconstruction of Ukraine. US and Russian companies could join to exploit the vast mineral wealth in the Arctic. There were no limits to what two long-time adversaries could achieve, Dmitriev argued. Their rival space industries could even pursue a joint mission to Mars with Elon Musk's SpaceX. For the Kremlin, the Miami talks were the culmination of a strategy hatched before Trump's inauguration to bypass the traditional US national security apparatus and convince the administration to view Russia not as a military threat, but as a land of bountiful opportunity. By dangling multi-billion-dollar rare earth and energy deals, Moscow could reshape the economic map of Europe while driving a wedge between America and its traditional allies. Dmitriev, a Goldman Sachs alumnus, had found receptive partners in Witkoff, Trump's longtime golfing partner, and Kushner, whose investment fund, Affinity Partners, drew billion-dollar investments from the Arab monarchies whose conflict with Israel he'd helped mediate. The piece then draws attention to deals already in the offing, and this is really significant. Quote, earlier this year, ExxonMobil met with Russia's biggest state energy company, Rosneft, to discuss returning to the massive Sakhalin gas project if Moscow and Washington gave the green light. Elsewhere, a cast of businessmen close to the Trump administration have been looking to position themselves as new economic links between the US and Russia. Gentry Beach, a college friend of Donald Trump Jr. and campaign donor to his father, has been in talks to acquire a stake in a Russian Arctic gas project if it is released from sanctions. Another Trump donor, Stephen P. Lynch, paid $600,000 this year to a lobbyist close to Trump Jr., who's helping him seek a Treasury Department license to buy the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from a Russian state-owned company. So, vitally important context as these talks unfold, and we'll link to that piece in the show notes. But let's turn to the key stories relating to Kyiv's domestic politics next, starting with the news of Yermak's resignation on Friday. In a statement afterwards, Zelensky said, "I'm grateful to Andriy for always presenting Ukraine's position in the negotiation track exactly as it needed to be." Privately, many European officials are relieved Yermak has gone, someone considered by many to be toxic both inside and outside Ukraine, as we discussed last week. It's certainly given a boost to many Ukrainians, but questions remain over whether his removal will strengthen or weaken Zelensky. Shortly after his resignation, Yermak texted an American journalist saying, "I'm going to the front and am prepared for any reprisals." It wasn't clear whether he meant he'd be enlisting or simply would be visiting the front lines. Well, now we have our answer, as he's just been photographed in uniform in front of a tank, presumably at the front. This is a remarkable turn of events with very far-reaching implications. President Trump has already commented on the problems the Ukrainians were facing, and it's widely believed the scandal is being used by the Americans as leverage in these talks. Perhaps the most interesting intervention as a consequence, however, came from former Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief, now Kyiv's ambassador to London, Valerii Zaluzhnyi, in our paper. He wrote an op-ed for The Telegraph, where the tone, timing and content read like the start of his much-anticipated presidential campaign. He sets out the strategic failures that have shaped Ukraine's position, describing the state of the Ukrainian military before the invasion with a shortage of everything, from people to weapons. He also outlines the evolution of Russian strategy, how Moscow shifted from an initial plan built around rapid defeat to a long war of attrition, building a war economy and increasing its industrial capacity, which Ukraine struggled to match. On the risks of any rush settlement, he says it will only lead to a devastating defeat and loss of independence, criticising how, in his view, the guarantees which would work, NATO membership, the stationing of nuclear assets or the permanent deployment of a large allied force, are not being seriously discussed. He also says that any peace, even if temporary, can create space for reforms, recovery and political renewal, strengthening the foundations of justice through the fight against corruption. This is certainly a very significant development for the future of Ukraine and is worth reading in full, so we'll link to that piece in the show notes as well. As for today, all eyes are on Adélie's hometown of Paris, where President Zelensky is currently meeting President Macron, seeking to shore up European support as the peace talks gather pace. Jean-Noël Barrot, the French foreign minister, said the meeting today was to move the negotiations forward. And Zelensky's just posted he's had a call with Finland's Alexander Stubb to update him on a very substantive day. But I know we're about to go to Dom for the military updates, but I mentioned France on Friday's episode, Adélie, because of their adoption of military service for the first time since it was phased out 25 years ago. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Francis, and well done on your pronunciation. We've worked on that ahead of the podcast. Yes, so Macron had a first go at this idea with the Service National Universel, the SNU, a few years ago, which had not been massively successful. It was very costly, and it was quite unclear what it was trying to achieve. It was not quite a military service. It seemed to be more of a desire to instill obedience in youth, which is something that Macron has hinted at several times throughout his 2 terms. So the news of Friday was surprisingly well received by public opinion. Polls say that 61% of the French public actually regret that military service was cancelled about 30 years ago, and 88% are quite happy with its reinstatement. And these numbers, surprisingly as well, are quite consistent across the political spectrum, mainly because the draft is on a voluntary basis. I think that is a key thing to understand. On the left, 63% approve. The Rassemblement National, the far right, Marine Le Pen's party, it's 82%. And in the loose middle, from the traditional right wing to the traditional left wing, we're around 80 to 85%. So it's all across the board quite well received. And I say surprising because a couple of weeks ago, as we've mentioned in this podcast, France's military chief of staff, General Fabien Mandon, had given a speech which had caused an uproar, where he said that as a country we must be ready to lose our children, and that he knew from intelligence that a conflict with Russia was more than probable by 2030. Now, it was very controversial on whether a military chief had the right to address the nation as such. He wasn't talking, however, about conscription and about the general French public that would have to go and die in case of conflict, but rather about military men and women. He was mostly reminding, I think, the public that war is always costly, no matter at what scale. It was a big media and political uproar, calling him warmongering, which is why it was so surprising how well received the news of the military service was. The following Tuesday, after the general's speech, Macron went to one of France's most popular morning shows to reassure everyone that the new military service was not meant to train French youth to go to Ukraine to fight, and that they would only be deployed on the national front should a conflict erupt. Nonetheless, what all of this points to is that General Mandon's speech, as well as Macron's announcement, is changing the national conversation around the prospect of war. It is all about how the government in France is trying to prepare, slowly but surely, by little touches here and there, public opinion for a future conflict. The contours of that domestic battle is obviously political, it's happening in the media, but also, simply put, it's happening at the dinner table, whether these conversations that were not happening 10, 15 years ago are now happening amongst military families as well as the general public. In his speech, Macron said, in an uncertain world where strength is overtaking the right and war is happening in the present tense, our nation is not allowed to be fearful, it is not allowed to panic, it's not allowed to not be prepared, and it's not allowed to be divided. We never avoid danger with fear. The only way to avoid it is to be prepared. So the French government is indeed walking a tightrope, not wanting to alarm the public, but also planting seeds. Among the interesting signals that the state is sending to the population is a recent report which aims to organize civilian resilience in case of crisis. It includes recommendations such as have an emergency kit ready at home, complete with cans of food, drinkable water, and the like. Sounds just like my grandmother, really. Just as we've discussed here in a British context, the question remains, is the government explaining this crisis well enough for the public to understand the urgency? Let's now go to Dom for the military updates.
Thank you, Adélie. Thank you, Adélie. And thank you, Francis. Right, military updates. This weekend, it was characterised by, firstly, yet more Russian aerial strikes on civilians. Overnight, Friday night, Saturday, saw Russia launch a combined missile and drone strike totaling 632 air vehicles. Ukraine's Air Force said it shot down 558 of the drones and 19 of the missiles, but more than 600,000 people in the Kyiv region were left without power on Saturday morning after strikes there. Ukraine's energy ministry said more than 500,000 people across Kyiv were in the capital itself, the rest in the surrounding oblast. DTEK Energy, which serves properties in Kyiv, said later on Saturday afternoon that power had been restored to more than 360,000. Now, the Moldova Ministry of Internal Affairs said on Saturday morning that 2 Russian drones had violated Moldovan airspace for over an hour during that strike, forcing Moldova to temporarily close its airspace. However, also In the night attack, Ukrainian forces successfully used the domestically produced Sting interceptor drone to shoot down several Geran 3 jet-powered long-range strike drones for the first time. So the Geran is the Russian family, if you like, of Shahed knockoffs. We've seen the Geran 1 and 2. The Geran 3 is jet-powered, so a slightly shorter flight range than the other Geran drones, but much higher speeds and the ability to manoeuvre. So it's much trickier for air defence systems to shoot it down, which is why these new Sting interceptor drones from Ukraine, domestically produced, are so interesting and important. Overnight Saturday, Sunday, it continued. 18 of 122 drones got through, killing 5, injuring nearly 50 across the country. However, the weekend was also characterised by Ukraine hitting Russia's Shadow Fleet tankers, the oil tankers going up and down the global seas without insurance. So the SBU Sea Baby drones, we are told, SBU being the security service of Ukraine, their model of maritime drones, the Sea Babies, hit 2 tankers, the Cairo and the Virat, in the Black Sea, critically damaging both vessels. They were both flagged to Gambia. They caught fire in the Black Sea just off Turkey after a number of explosions. All 25 crew evacuated from the Cairo. They went off to Novorossiysk, and 20 crew on board the Virat were made safe. That one was 35 miles offshore. That comes from the Turkish Transport Ministry. Now, there's very dramatic footage. You'll find it on our website and elsewhere of the strikes of these vessels. Then a third vessel, a Turkish-owned tanker called the Mersin, was hit as it was carrying Russian oil off the coast of Senegal. The coast of Senegal. This is where Ukraine has taken the fight to. That vessel was reported sinking. The crew was evacuated. Just briefly sticking in the maritime world, Ukraine's Foreign Affairs Ministry said on Friday that Russia's international isolation had deepened, having once again, in their words, failed to secure a seat on the International Maritime Organization Council. That follows Russia's failure to get seats on the UNESCO and the board of the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, as we spoke about last week. Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andriy Yermak, said in a statement, Russia is a terrorist state that systematically violates international law, attacks civilian vessels, destroys port infrastructure, and operates a shadow fleet in blatant disregard of safety standards. It is therefore logical that Moscow cannot sit on the executive body of the International Maritime Organization. His ministry said in a statement, today's vote shows that the international community will not accept unlawful conduct at sea. Russia has no place in the governing bodies of international organizations. Now, on the ground, let's go into the Donbass. Ukrainian military observer Konstantin Mashevets said yesterday that Ukrainian forces have counterattacked in the vicinity of Pokrovsk. They've pushed Russian troops, we are told, to the southern outskirts of Rodinska. That's a few kilometres to the north. It's thought that Russia's 51st Combined Arms Army have still not been able to close that pocket north of Pokrovsk and Menorad. They are seemingly needing to be reinforced by elements of the relatively elite 336th Naval Infantry Brigade and the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade. The spokesperson of a Ukrainian brigade in the area said yesterday that Russian forces are sending poorly trained, recently recruited personnel into the first wave of assaults, and if they are at all successful, they are followed by relatively better trained personnel. I think the word relatively is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Now, just to give a neat summation of the ground war, because it's been very dominated by politics, the landscape here for the last couple of weeks, but a neat summation of the ground war in Ukraine was offered on Saturday by the Institute for the Study of War, the US-based think tank. They said the current Russian force composition is not optimized to achieve or exploit a collapse of Ukrainian defenses. The war in Ukraine has become largely positional, and Russian forces writ large are sufficiently degraded such that they cannot currently conduct manoeuvre warfare at the scale necessary for rapid operational level advances that restore manoeuvre to the battlefield. Russian forces have become optimized to fight positional warfare with low quality personnel, insufficient armour and mechanized equipment stores, and poor command and control. Russian forces are currently conducting positional offensive operations as part of Putin's effort to outlast Western support for Ukraine. ISW say Russian forces use 3 to 5 people on average for infiltration and assault operations, largely conducted on foot and only occasionally using light motorized civilian vehicles such as motorcycles, buggies and all-terrain vehicles. Ukraine's drone-based defences, colloquially called the Wall of Drones, have some vulnerabilities that Russian forces have managed to exploit to make tactically significant advances, but overall have denied Russian forces the ability to use armoured vehicles and conduct mechanised manoeuvre, such that it has degraded the overall quality and ability of Russian forces to conduct such operations. I think that is a pretty neat outline of where we are. So that push, which still seems to be continuing west for Russia in the Dnipropetrovsk-Zaporizhzhia Oblast border area, that seems to be one area where this drone wall has not yet sewn that up, plus the obstacle belt that we spoke of last week is not entirely intact there, but elsewhere it's back to the grind. Elsewhere, Britain's Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer and NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte spoke yesterday, we are told. A Downing Street spokesperson said the Prime Minister spoke to NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte this morning. The leaders began by taking stock of the situation in Ukraine. Peace talks in recent days had gained momentum, but the focus had to be on securing a just and lasting peace for Ukraine, both underlined. The leaders discussed the work being done by the Coalition of the Willing to prepare for a cessation of hostilities and welcomed the close coordination between the grouping and NATO on next steps. The leaders look forward to speaking again soon. And that was it. That's all we got. So I hope a lot more happened behind closed doors, because that's pretty rubbish. Could have done that in a tweet. Anyway, last one for me. The head of NATO's military committee said the alliance is reassessing how it confronts hybrid threats that have intensified across Europe. Speaking to the Financial Times, Admiral Giuseppe Cavo-Dragoni, who chairs the committee, so he's not the head of NATO, even though he's technically the most senior officer. I think he's got a staff of about 2 to run his office, so he's got no formal role in the military chain, but he is the head of NATO's military committee. He said, "We are studying everything. On cyber, we're kind of reactive. Being more aggressive or more proactive instead of reactive is something that we are thinking about." And then he said a preemptive strike could in some circumstances be viewed as defensive action, while noting that such an approach is further away from our normal way of thinking and behaviour. He said how deterrence is achieved, through retaliation or through preemptive strike, this is something we have to analyse deeply, because there could be in the future even more pressure on this. Now, Russia obviously never misses a chance to play the victim, came out the blocks quickly. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said the remarks were seen by Moscow as an extremely irresponsible step, indicating the alliance's readiness to continue moving towards escalation. She said, "We see in it a deliberate attempt to undermine efforts to overcome the Ukrainian crisis. The people making such statements should be aware of the risks and possible consequences, including for the alliance members themselves, blah, 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 blah." Now, Admiral Dragoni then highlighted NATO's Baltic Sentry mission as an example of successful deterrence at the moment. He said from the beginning of Baltic Sentry, nothing has happened. So this means that this deterrence is working. You'll remember Baltic Sentry is ships, aircraft, naval drones to monitor critical infrastructure in the Baltic Sea following those multiple cable cutting incidents in 23 and 2024. All of that comes after authorities in Lithuania yesterday had to briefly suspend operations at Vilnius International Airport after unidentified objects, which were believed to be more of these weather balloons, were spotted in the area. Airspace reopened at 5 a.m. local this morning. Been quite a bit of this recently. Officials in Vilnius say the weather balloons are actually used by smugglers to ferry illicit cigarettes across the border from Belarus. They say the Belarusian authorities know this and allow this. Comes in the wake of the 2 border crossing points between Belarus and Lithuania being shut in October. So still no improvement there between their relations. And that's us up to date, Adélie.
Thanks, Dom. And let's go now to our Brussels correspondent, Joe Barnes. Joe, welcome back to the podcast. We reported on Friday your exclusive story for The Telegraph that the US is poised to recognize Russia's control over Crimea and other occupied Ukrainian territories in order to secure a peace deal. It's a big scoop. Well done. What has the reaction been in Brussels?
Hi, folks. I won't go into the story too much because I know you did a fantastic job of telling it on the pod last week. But yeah, as one could expect, it was pretty bad in terms of the response. It's actually a huge break between Europe and America. It would go against convention precedent. So if you remember when the Baltic states were occupied by the Soviet Union, the United States essentially made the historic, now completely justified decision to recognize them as de facto, yes, controlled by Russia and the Soviet Union, but de jure, they were independent states. And that was essentially keeping the lights on for that time, for one day, when they can rejoin the Western world. And basically, people are going, you know what, Donald Trump has forgotten that. But it just tells a lot about what relationship exists between America and Europe at the moment. And European Union defence ministers are meeting in Brussels today for what was meant to be discussing various sort of things to do with EU defence, but then obviously Ukraine dominates. And they were saying, oh, look, like ministers were being asked, are you happy with Europe's seat at the table? And they're like, of course we're involved. But actually, in reality, they know they're not. And that can't be more illustrated than the fact that despite what Europe's going to do, America looks like it's going to go ahead and recognise Russia's occupation of Donetsk, of Luhansk, of Crimea, of parts of Zaporizhzhia region, of Kherson. And that's not good news if you're European fighting for a seat at the table and essentially being completely ignored.
Yeah, so is your sense that the occupied territories is something that the US would be considering recognising even if Ukraine and the European allies do not? The real sense here, the picture, is that what Ukraine and the Europeans are saying does not matter in the way they're dealing with this.
Yeah, exactly that. And one well-placed source told us that it's increasingly clear that the Americans don't care about the European position. They say the Europeans can do whatever they want. So essentially, even if the EU, the UK, other countries, there's plenty of G7 supporters of Ukraine, Japan, Canada, don't follow the US in recognising Russian control over these territories and to say we're not allowing borders to be moved by force, the Americans just look like they're going to do it anyway. And that's probably why that nugget of information slipped out, because it's a subtle way of sources telling us that, look, we're being ignored here and we should highlight this, because I'm sure that this is now a story that is also reverberating around the corridors of power in Washington, and the Congress going to be happy when they hear that this is happening or potentially on the cards. And it was, as it was described to me by one well-placed Ukrainian source, that it's just one of many horrible ideas that's floating around this peace process. So potentially we're going to hear some more shocking details that may be worse than this to come.
And it's also pressuring Europe to fight for its seat at the table. There are big meetings today, as Francis mentioned, on the upcoming potential decision at the end of December about the reparations loan.
Yeah, so look, the EU is desperately trying to get this across the line. Belgium still resists and is opposing this deal, this 140 billion euro loan to Ukraine, guaranteed by Russian frozen assets. If Russia doesn't pay reparations to Ukraine in the future, then Ukraine will be able to basically use the frozen assets in Europe to pay that money back. So yeah, look, that is still very much plan A in everyone's mind, but is very much blocked. December, that deadline is looming. It's the 18th and 19th of December. So we really have this 3 weeks to get that arranged. And I just don't see it happening. It doesn't feel like that they're going to reach a consensus point by that. And potentially, is it because now we have a two-track approach? When this idea was first mooted, we were speaking about just a reparations loan to fund Ukraine's ongoing war of resistance against Russia. Now we're in a position where there is a peace framework on the table, whether we like it or not, which mentions what happens to Russia's, or we believe the previous renditions had mentioned what happens to Russia's frozen assets in Europe. And as we know from the American recognition over the occupied territories, they don't really care what Europe thinks, even though Europe, Emmanuel Macron and others, have been saying, actually, what happens, that any decisions made over frozen assets in Europe can only be taken by Europe. But as we know, Trump's attitude to Europe, he's probably promising something completely different to Putin. Well, he will be tomorrow, I think, when Witkoff and Jared Kushner arrive.
Thanks, Joe. A last question before we go on to final thoughts. I think there's a lot happening in the Netherlands at the moment today about Europe donations. Do you want to catch us up about that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting case study, we could call it. The Netherlands has been without a proper government for a while since it collapsed. They've held elections, but it takes the Dutch government, or any people trying to form the Dutch government, a very long time to build a coalition. But one thing that has survived all of their caretaker governments in recent years is the country's support for Ukraine. And today, they've announced that they are putting another 250 million euros into the Pearl package. So that's the European system that buys American weapons for Ukraine. And Ruben Brekelmans, their defense minister, was saying that that's going to go towards F-16 ammunition, Patriot ammunition. But then we've got another interesting scenario, and I think that's tomorrow. The Dutch Parliament is having a vote on whether they should continue funding Ukrainian aid, and it's expected to pass with ease, because that's one thing the Dutch Parliament has always done, is supported Ukraine, and it's one of those sort of bipartisan efforts in the country. So we expect that's going to be agreed tomorrow, and it's going to mean the Netherlands can at least donate 2 billion euros worth of aid to Ukraine next year. That will be in terms of helping purchase Pearl packages if that system still goes on beyond the end of the year, but also doing its own purchasing on the international market, maybe donating some existing kit and buying new stuff for itself. But that's interesting how, despite not having a proper government, the Netherlands is still backing Ukraine.
Let's go now to final thoughts. Dom, do you want to start?
Thanks, Adélie. Something I've been meaning to talk to you about for a while, and I'd really welcome your thoughts on this. I'm very concerned about where the moral compass is at the moment for the United States and what it means. So, what am I talking about here? US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said over the weekend, he said the EU doesn't get to determine what international law is, and they certainly don't get to determine how the US defends its national security. He said the US is under attack from organised criminal narco-terrorists in our hemisphere, and the president is responding in the defence of our country. Now, he was talking in the wake of allegations that Pete Hegseth had ordered the US military to kill everybody when he launched the strikes against alleged drug trafficking boat in the Caribbean. 2 people initially survived the first strike when the US fired a missile at a vessel off the Trinidadian coast in early September. But Mr. Hegseth reportedly then ordered a second strike on the pair as they clung to the wreckage. This is according to the Washington Post, but it's widely reported. Now, a Democratic congressman suggested the attack amounted to a war crime, which would result in the prosecution of officials. Donald Trump, who's claimed sweeping wartime powers to destroy these boats, said the US is in an armed conflict with drug cartels because each of the boats carries enough drugs to kill lots of Americans. His administration has killed 82 people since it launched a campaign against the so-called narco boats about 3 months ago. Admiral Frank Mitch Bradley is said to have ordered the second strike, fulfilling Mr. Hegseth's directive, reportedly saying the survivors were legitimate targets because they could contact other smugglers to retrieve them and their cargo. Right, now, that's the background. At issue here is the long-standing convention of international law that says persons who have been incapacitated by shipwreck or otherwise in a helpless state at sea, offering no threat, should not be the object of an attack, just as pilots who have been shot down, parachuting down, posing no threat, cannot be engaged. Now, international law is not a single law defined by one nation or even a group of nations. It is the product of treaties, UN resolutions, stuff that's ratified by states, customary practice, judicial decisions that basically constitute best practice for the world, if you like. It is consensual. It's a descriptor of where we as humanity want to be. These are my words. Feel free to disagree with them. Now, it might be legal, to put this into brass tacks, it might be a legal act, according to the laws of your village, for example, to rape, pillage and plunder the neighbouring village and grab their potatoes. But the global community has evolved through wars and other great tests to say that whilst rape, pillage and plunder might be legal in your country, we as a community of global nations don't think that's very nice. So over time, it becomes, if not legally outlawed, because there is no overarching global power, then it becomes accepted that that kind of behaviour is not how we want humanity to develop. So international law is the global order that we keep talking about. International law shapes the free world that the US claims to lead. States adhere to this international law voluntarily. The danger is if a state views international law as a convenient mechanism to be accepted when it suits them, and inconvenient and therefore dismissible when it doesn't suit them, they shouldn't be surprised when other states or actors similarly disregard established international legal norms when acting against that state, either in war or peace. So Mr. Rubio said the US is under attack from organised criminal narco-terrorists in our hemisphere, and the president is responding in the defence of our country. Fine. It was explained that the survivors of the strike on that boat would most likely go back to being drug dealers. In my view, apart from going against established international law, this case is also problematic because of that idea that you can take preemptive action, including with lethal force, because of what somebody might do in the future. That is a dangerous road. Osama bin Laden made that case. He said that because we, the electorate in Western democracies, had chosen to vote into power people who would then likely act counter to his beliefs and interests, that made us legitimate targets. It was a false argument then. It is again now. I don't think those people in the water should have been hit again. I'm very concerned for where the moral compass of the United States is right now and what it means for the future of international law and the global order. And I would welcome your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dom. My final thought is thinking about Yermak and his resigning over the weekend. Few things that came to my mind. Is it leaving Zelensky vulnerable? Because Yermak was the shield that was attracting all of the criticism, and is Zelensky going to be the focus now of all of that criticism? Of course, one could say that by sacrificing Yermak, Zelensky is protecting himself. He's getting rid of the parts of the system that are rotten. But by pushing Yermak out this late in the process, when he's attracted so much criticism domestically, internationally, when this ongoing corruption probe has been going on for so long and touching so many people in the government, given how wide it's been happening, it's hard not to imagine that Zelensky had no inkling that this was happening or that he's not involved in it himself. In either case, that doesn't really reflect well on him as a leader. And then finally, if Yermak indeed had his fingers in all the pies, can Zelensky really govern without him? Will the system implemented by Yermak and all the people he's placed in various positions, institutions, will they survive? How much of Zelensky's power and leadership is based on the duo he had formed with Yermak over the years, ever since his beginnings in TV? I'm really curious to hear your thoughts about this and what you think, and that's definitely something we'll be monitoring and continuing to think about over the next few weeks and months. Joe, what's your final thought?
Yeah, I just want to come back to the European leadership role in supporting Ukraine through this peace process. One of my very senior contacts in Brussels was saying we need Macron to step up and actually grab this process by the scruff of its neck and be the voice to support Ukraine and Europe's interests. Previously, people have looked to Keir Starmer for that, but he's been very subtle in his language, saying nothing that would annoy Donald Trump and his administration, whereas Emmanuel Macron, his foreign minister, Jean-Noël Barrot, have come out and used the words like Ukraine can't sign anything that's a capitulation and basic warning against the terms of the 28-point plan that was floated, this Russian-US proposal. And now it just strikes me as really interesting that President Zelensky goes to Paris the day before the Americans fly to Moscow, the day after, and he will be briefed by Umarov in Paris, as we understand. That once would have probably been Britain, and he actually hasn't been to Britain for a while. And you'll remember, if you cast your mind back just a few weeks, he was in France to sign the deal for 150 Rafale jets for part of post-war security guarantees. So it's just interesting that he's gone back there, and potentially Emmanuel Macron and his government's more front-footed language makes France the destination for most support for Ukraine in Europe, and that country willing to stand up to Donald Trump from screwing Europe over. So it's interesting how France has taken that lead, that initiative in the process all of a sudden.
Thank you, Joe. I think in France, a lot of people would say that we're going through quite a Gaullist moment from Charles de Gaulle in terms of taking a leadership or wanting to take one, wanting to have a role, that's for sure, but also being independent in strategic assets and conversations. Whether that is true or not, and whether that's an accurate description of the conversation at the European scale, that's something we need to think about. Francis, where do you want to leave us?
Well, thanks, Adélie. I wanted to point listeners to an interesting interview in our paper by David Blair with renowned military historian Sir Anthony Beevor, though we'd actually learn in the piece that's a term he dislikes, saying military historian neglects the ordeal of civilians in conflict, which is, as anyone who reads his works will know, is another really core subject of his writings. Now, in the interview, he argues, quote, "With the Russians, the attitude has always been that conspicuous cruelty is a necessary weapon of war, and we're seeing this in Ukraine." He goes on. Some will argue that it goes back to the 13th century and the Mongol invasions. But then one has to remember how appalling the 30 Years' War was in Europe. The difference being that we had afterwards the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment actually had an effect. And then, in the 19th century, there was an attempt to, shall we say, civilise warfare with the creation of the Red Cross and attitudes like that. But as far as Russia is concerned, nobody judges a victor. Sir Anthony then predicts Putin will press on, tormenting Ukraine regardless of any peace agreement. He says he will certainly want to continue the war. Even if there is some form of ceasefire or peace negotiation, he will break that and blame it on Ukraine and the Europeans. And once again, count on Trump wanting to be a proved peacemaker. And Trump will agree with Putin that it's the fault of Ukraine somehow, even when the evidence points in a totally different direction. So I don't see the possibility of real peace. He then ends with this sobering reflection. The British and the French could not believe after the First World War that anybody would be stupid enough to want another war. That's why they underestimated Hitler and how far he was likely to go. We've seen a similar thing in the 2000s with Angela Merkel and, to a certain degree, others. Nobody believed that anyone would want to have another ground war on the European landmass again. But we should have realised that under Putin, the sheer brutality of the Russian way of war could well be reapplied on the European landmass. Sir Anthony is always worth listening to, and we'll link to that piece too in the show notes. Until tomorrow, everyone.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and Francis Dearnley answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights. Plus, maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each day on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.